The light came slowly to the neighborhoods that had grown up on the eastern edge of Nassau County in the years after the Second World War, filtering first through the Venetian blinds of the bedroom windows, then spreading in pale rectangles across the linoleum floors of the kitchens below. The air carried the particular stillness of an early autumn morning in a residential neighborhood, cool and faintly damp, broken only by the distant sound of a commuter train running south toward the city, and closer, the mechanical ticking of a kitchen clock. The houses on these streets, modest Cape Cod and ranch-style homes, each with 2 or 3 bedrooms, a single bathroom, and a backyard bounded by chain-link fencing, stood in rows so uniform that a visitor arriving for the first time might have had difficulty identifying, without checking the painted numbers above each door, which house was meant. A woman was already awake. The post-war years had reshaped the American landscape with a velocity that had no precedent in the country's prior history. Between 1945 and 1958, more than 13 million new homes were constructed across the United States, the majority of them in the planned suburban communities that multiplied around every major metropolitan area. Levittown in New York and Pennsylvania, Park Forest outside Chicago, Lakewood near Los Angeles. The men who returned from Europe and the Pacific finished their educations under the terms of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, found work in the expanding manufacturing and service sectors, and settled their families in these new houses, carry with them a set of assumptions about domestic life that had been ratified with near uniform agreement by the government, the church, the popular press, and the psychiatric profession. The role of wife and mother occupied, in this period, a position of considerable cultural weight. It was not simply what most women did. It was what women were understood by the dominant institutions of American public life to exist for. The infrastructure that maintained this understanding was not informal or improvised. It had been constructed deliberately over the course of the late 1940s and to the first years of the 1950s through an interlocking network of publishing houses, women's magazines, university home economics departments, and civic organizations that together produced what amounted to a codified body of instructions for how a woman in mid-century America was expected to live. The volume of this material was considerable, and its reach was wider than any comparable literature that had come before it. By 1955, the combined monthly circulation of the 3 leading American women's magazines, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and Good Housekeeping, had reached approximately 14 million copies, and a substantial portion of each issue was given over to advice on domestic management, personal presentation, and marital conduct. The women reading these magazines lived primarily in the new suburban communities that had spread outward from every American city since the end of the war, and the magazines were written for them with a precision of assumption that reflected the near-total demographic uniformity of their intended readership. McCall's, under its editor Otis Wees, introduced in 1954 a governing editorial concept that it would refine and promote throughout the remainder of the decade. The concept was called togetherness, and it described a model of domestic life in which the husband and wife existed not as separate individuals with independent interests, but as a single social unit, defined entirely by the shared project of building a home and raising children. The word appeared on the cover of the May 1954 issue and was thereafter deployed as both a descriptive and a prescriptive term. It named a quality that a well-functioning American family was understood to possess, and it implied, without stating directly, that families lacking this quality had failed in some essential way. The editor of Ladies' Home Journal, Bruce Gould, was pursuing a parallel editorial strategy, filling the magazine's pages with features on meal planning, child psychology, household decoration, and the management of social obligations, each presented in a register that combined practical instruction with the quiet authority of received cultural wisdom. The implicit message threading through both publications was identical. Domestic life, practiced correctly, was a skilled profession requiring continuous study and deliberate effort. It was within this publishing environment that the document now widely known as the Good Wife's Guide appeared in the May 13, 1955 issue of Housekeeping Monthly. The piece, structured as a numbered list of recommendations for how a wife should conduct herself during the hours preceding and following her husband's return from work, had a directness of tone that distinguished it from a more elaborate advice features occupying adjacent pages. Its instructions were specific and ordinal, covering matters from the preparation of the evening meal to the management of a wife's facial expression and emotional register. A wife was advised to have dinner ready at the time her husband expected it, as the arrival of a hot, well-prepared meal constituted, in the article's framing, the husband's primary domestic entitlement after the demands of his working day. She was advised to touch up her makeup and put a ribbon in her hair, so that he would see a wife who had made an effort rather than one who had been defeated by her domestic responsibilities. The article counseled against greeting a husband with complaints or problems, describing such behavior as placing an unfair burden on a man who had been managing the pressures of the outside world throughout the day, and it suggested that a wife's role during the evening hours was essentially supportive and responsive, to listen, to inquire gently, and never to question his judgment or challenge his account of events. These were not fringe instructions. The register and assumptions of the Good Wife's Guide were entirely consistent with the broader advice literature of the period, and the document found so receptive an audience that versions of it circulated far beyond the original publication, reproduced in church bulletins, cited in high school home economics classes, and passed between neighbors with an air of simple endorsement. What made it notable in retrospect was only its compression. It distilled into a single page what the advice columns of the major women's magazines communicated over thousands of pages across many years. The detailed and the condensed versions of this guidance rested on identical foundations. The academic literature of the period was engaged in the same project, though it pursued its conclusions through the language of social science rather than practical instruction. In 1947, Ferdinand Lundberg, a journalist and historian, and Mary Nia Farnham, a psychiatrist practicing in New York City, published a book titled Modern Woman, The Lost Sex, which became one of the more widely discussed texts of the post-war domestic debate. Lundberg and Farnham's argument was, in essence, that the independent woman was a psychological aberration produced by the distortions of modernity and feminism, which they described as a deep illness afflicting modern civilization. Their thesis held that a woman who sought fulfillment outside the domestic sphere was not exercising a legitimate aspiration, but was instead exhibiting a neurotic flight from her authentic biological function, and that the resulting disorder expressed itself in unhappiness, marital failure, and the psychological damage of children. The book sold widely and was reviewed seriously in the major periodicals. Treated not as a polemical tract, but as a contribution to genuine scientific understanding. Its influence on the popular press was considerable. Many of the advice features that appeared in the women's magazines of the early 1950s were drawing, whether consciously or not, on the framework that Lundberg and Farnham had provided. The academic sociologists who studied marriage and family in this period were, as a professional community, largely in agreement with the central premise of this framework, though they expressed it in the cooler vocabulary of social science. Paul H. Landis, a sociologist at Washington State University, published Making the Most of Marriage in 1955, and the book, which went through multiple editions and was adopted as a standard text in college family studies courses across the country, presented female domesticity as both psychologically natural and socially necessary. Landis framed the division of labor within marriage in terms that presented it as a rational and mutually beneficial arrangement. The husband, suited by temperament and social conditioning to the public world, managed a family's relationship with that world. The wife, suited by nature and inclination to the domestic sphere, managed a household and the rearing of children. The gender assumptions embedded in this framing were presented not as ideological positions, but as documented social facts. Judson T. Landis and Mary G. Landis, a husband and wife team at the University of California, Berkeley, published Building a Successful Marriage in 1948, and the textbook remained in continuous use through the 1950s in its successive revised editions, reaching hundreds of thousands of students in courses on marriage preparation and family studies. The Landis' approach was somewhat more sociologically nuanced than that of Lundberg and Farnham, but their conclusions on the organization of the household were substantially similar. The wife's primary responsibility was to the emotional and physical management of the domestic environment, and her success in this responsibility was the primary determinant of the family's stability and happiness. Clifford Kirkpatrick, a sociologist at Indiana University whose 1955 textbook, The Family as Process and Institution, was widely assigned in graduate programs as well as undergraduate courses, offered a structural analysis of the wife's role that was, if anything, more demanding in its expectations than the popular press. Kirkpatrick described the American housewife of the post-war period as occupying what he called the companion wife role, a category that combined the functions of domestic manager, social companion, sexual partner, and emotional support system into a single continuous performance. The companion wife, as Kirkpatrick defined her, was expected to be simultaneously competent and deferential, intellectually engaging and non-threatening, attractive and undemanding, a constellation of qualities that placed a woman who attempted to embody it in a condition of permanent, low-level self-contradiction. The textbook's analysis of this role was descriptive rather than critical. Kirkpatrick presented the companion wife ideal as the natural adaptive response of American women to their social conditions, not as an externally imposed burden. Philip Wiley, whose 1942 book Generation of Vipers had introduced the term monism into American cultural discourse, remained a significant presence in the domestic advice conversation of the 1950s, though his influence was somewhat different in character. Wiley's argument had been directed not at housewives who failed to perform their domestic role adequately, but at those who, in his formulation, performed it with excessive devotion and used their domestic authority to emasculate and control the men and children in their care. The influence of the Wiley critique in the popular press was a peculiar one. It added to the existing anxiety about inadequate domesticity a simultaneous anxiety about excessive domesticity, creating a condition in which a housewife could be criticized equally for falling short of her obligations and for investing too heavily in them. The woman who failed to have dinner ready was neglecting her husband. The woman who sacrificed everything to her household was smothering him. This double bind was, in practice, unnavigable, and its presence in the advice literature of the period produced a specific variety of anxious attentiveness in its readers that the magazines were well positioned to address through provision of still more advice. The circulation figures of the major women's publications reflected the appetite for this guidance. By 1953, Ladies' Home Journal had a paid circulation of approximately 5,400,000 copies per month, making it one of the highest circulation publications in the United States. Good Housekeeping, whose Good Housekeeping seal of approval, established in 1909 but refined and promoted vigorously in the post-war years, had by 1955 reached a monthly circulation of approximately 3,500,000 copies. McCall's was reaching approximately 4.5 million readers per month by the middle of the decade. The editorial staffs of all three publications were dominated by men, a fact that would later receive considerable attention from the early critics of this literature. But the readership was almost entirely female, and the publications shaped their editorial content to address women in a register that combined reassurance with correction, affirming the value of the domestic role, while consistently implying that the reader needed to be doing it somewhat better than she currently was. The advice that filled these pages covered every conceivable dimension of household management, but it returned with particular frequency to certain categories of concern: the preparation and presentation of food, the physical appearance of the wife and the domestic space, the management of the husband's emotional state, and the cultivation of a social life that reflected well on the family standing. These categories were not treated as separate subjects, but as interlocking components of a single continuous obligation. A woman who set an attractive table but neglected her own appearance had failed as surely as one who maintained her appearance but produced an inadequate meal. A woman who kept a clean house but failed to participate adequately in the social life of the neighborhood had fallen short of the full expectation. The advice literature did not offer these obligations as a hierarchy in which one or two were sufficient. It presented them as a comprehensive and non-negotiable totality. Helen Andelin, a homemaker in Santa Barbara, California, began teaching informal classes to women in her community in the late 1950s that drew on many of the same assumptions undergirding the major publications, though she approached them from the direction of Christian domesticity rather than secular social science. Her classes, which she would eventually consolidate into a published volume in 1963 under the title Fascinating Womanhood, reached several thousand women through informal channels before the book's publication, circulating initially as mimeograph study materials passed between participants in church discussion groups. Andelin's framework presented the ideal wife as one who cultivated a specific set of feminine qualities, what she described as inner happiness, childlike trust, and dependence on her husband, not as a performance of subjugation, but as an expression of a woman's truest and most fulfilling nature. The classes attracted women who found in Andelin's framework a religious and moral legitimation for the domestic role that the secular advice literature was less well equipped to provide. The significant overlap between Andolin's prescriptions and those of the women's magazines and the academic sociologists was not incidental. It reflected the degree to which the domestic ideology of the period had achieved what amounted to a cross-institutional consensus. This consensus was not maintained by any single institution or coordinated campaign, but by the accumulated weight of many institutions speaking in slightly different registers in the same direction. The church, the university, the popular magazine, the advice manual, the high school home economics curriculum, the advertising agency. Each contributed its own language and its own authority to a shared set of expectations that, taken together, constituted a nearly seamless environmental pressure. A woman living in suburban Nassau County, or in Park Forest outside Chicago, or in Lakewood near Los Angeles, encountered this pressure not as external coercion, but as a texture of ordinary social life. The instructions for how to be a wife were not confined to the pages of any particular publication. They were present in the conversations of neighbors, in the assessment of mothers-in-law, in the standards implied by the domestic arrangements of every household on the street. The advice literature of a period did not create this system. It gave it language, and in doing so, it made the system's expectations both more precise and, in a particular way, harder to dispute. The bridging sentence to what followed naturally from this. The rules written in Ladies' Home Journal and in Housekeeping Monthly and in the textbooks of Paul H. Landis and Clifford Kirkpatrick were not, in the end, abstract recommendations. They described with considerable specificity the physical appearance and daily conduct of a woman in the hours before her husband rose in the morning, and that description had the force, in the communities where it circulated, of something very close to law. The instructions that appeared in Housekeeping Monthly and Ladies' Home Journal were most exacting and most revealing of their underlying assumptions when they addressed the question of a woman's physical appearance during the hours of the domestic day. The expectation that a wife should present herself in a state of complete grooming before her husband rose in the morning was not confined to a single publication or a single author. It appeared with consistency that reflected genuine cultural consensus across the full range of advice literature produced during the period. The reasoning offered in support of this expectation was generally presented in terms of consideration and respect. A wife who allowed herself to be seen in a state of incomplete dress or with her hair in pin curls or her face unmade was described as failing to extend to her husband the same courtesies she would offer a guest. The deeper logic, which the advice literature did not always articulate but which its structure made plain, was that a wife's physical appearance at every hour of the day was understood to be a form of domestic output, as much a part of her household management as the cleanliness of the kitchen floor or the quality of the evening meal. Her appearance was not her own private matter. It was part of the household's presentation to the world, and the world, in this context, began at the bedroom door. The American cosmetics industry had been preparing for this cultural moment for some years before it arrived. Helena Rubinstein, who had opened her first American salon on Fifth Avenue in New York City in 1915 and had built her company into a substantial enterprise over following decades, understood by the early 1940s that the primary market for cosmetic products was not the wealthy woman who visited her salon, but the ordinary woman managing a household on a moderate budget in a medium-sized city, or, increasingly, a suburban development. Elizabeth Arden, whose Red Door salons had established a particular register of cosmetic luxury since the 1910s, was pursuing the same mass-market expansion through her cosmetic lines sold in department stores and drugstores across the country. By 1950, both companies had made the transition from exclusive salon services to broadly distributed product lines, and the industry as a whole was generating revenues of approximately $400 million per year, a figure that would more than double to approximately $1 billion by 1960. The post-war economic expansion, the demographic concentration of women in the new suburban communities, and the intensified cultural emphasis on feminine appearance as a domestic obligation all contributed to this growth in roughly equal measure. It was within this expanding market that Charles Revson, who had founded Revlon with his brother Joseph Revson, and the chemist Charles Lockman in 1932, built his company into the dominant force in American mass-market cosmetics during the 1950s. Revson's most significant contribution to the cultural landscape of the decade was the Fire and Ice campaign, which appeared in the pages of Vogue in November 1952, and was quickly reproduced in women's magazines and newspapers across the country. The campaign, created by the copywriter Kay Daly at the advertising agency William Esty Company, was built around a quiz of 15 questions inviting readers to determine whether their personality matched the fire and ice woman, a figure defined by a combination of sophistication, social confidence, and a controlled but visible sexuality. The advertisement's framing was notable for what it implied about its intended audience. It addressed the woman reader as someone capable of being that figure if she chose the correct product, installing cosmetic purchase as a hinge between a woman's current self and her idealized self. The Fire and Ice lipstick and nail enamel sold in quantities that surpassed any previous cosmetics launch, and the campaign's underlying architecture, the quiz, the aspirational self-identification, the product as transformation, became a template that the industry would replicate throughout the decade. Estee Lauder, who had founded her company in 1946 after years of mixing and selling face creams developed by her uncle John Schatz, a chemist in the Flushing neighborhood of Queens, was by 1950 pursuing a strategy somewhat different from Revson's. Where Revson built Revlon on the power of color and the appeal of desire, Lauder built her early business on the power of skincare and the appeal of quality, placing her products in the better department stores of New York, and using demonstrations and complimentary samples to build a reputation among women who were willing to spend more for products they trusted. Pond's Cold Cream, which had been selling its products since the 1890s and had constructed its post-war advertising around testimonials from socially prominent women, occupied a different position in the market hierarchy. It was less aspirational than Revlon, more straightforwardly functional, but addressed the same fundamental cultural premise that the maintenance of a woman's skin and face was a serious obligation requiring dedicated products and consistent effort. The combined effect of these various advertising campaigns, reaching their audience through the pages of Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal, and through the new medium of television, was to establish cosmetic maintenance not as a luxury or a personal indulgence, but as a baseline expectation of feminine respectability. The specific morning routine implied by this literature was neither quick nor simple. The advice columns and beauty features of the period described a sequence of tasks that began before the first light was fully established. The removal of the cold cream or night cream applied the previous evening, the washing the face with mild soap and cool water, the application of a toning lotion, the application of foundation in the appropriate shade, Max Factor's pancake, which had been developed for motion picture use and reformulated for consumer sale in 1940, was among the most widely used. The application of powder, the careful drawing of the eyebrows, the application of mascara, and the selection and application of a lipstick in the correct shade for the day's anticipated activities. The hair, if not set the previous evening with pin curls secured beneath a hairnet, required at minimum a brushing and arrangement that achieved the smooth, controlled waves that the prevailing aesthetic demanded. The entire process, performed with the care that the advice literature specified, required between 30 and 45 minutes, and it was to be completed before the children needed attention and, ideally, before the husband's alarm clock sounded. The Clairol Company, which had been selling hair color products since the 1930s, transformed the social landscape of hair coloring in 1956 with the introduction of an advertising campaign created by the copywriter Shirley Polikoff at the agency Foot, Cone and Belding. The campaign's headline, "Does She or Doesn't She?" addressed one of the most persistent social stigmas attached to hair coloring, which was the association of artificially colored hair with women of questionable morality. Polikoff's genius was to phrase the question in terms that made the ambiguity itself the point. If a woman's hair color was sufficiently natural-looking, its artificiality was undetectable, and undetectability was proof of quality. The campaign was initially rejected by the editorial staff of Life magazine on the grounds that its double meaning was too suggestive for a general interest publication, but it was accepted by Ladies' Home Journal, where it performed with immediate and dramatic effectiveness. Within 3 years of the campaign's launch, the number of American women coloring their hair had increased from approximately 7% to approximately 50% of the adult female population, a shift that reflected not only the effectiveness of the advertising, but the broader cultural pressure on women to maintain a standard of appearance that, for many, natural aging made increasingly difficult to achieve. Foundation garments occupied a position in the daily dressing routine that was, in the 1950s, as non-negotiable as the application of lipstick. The girdle, a term that covered a range of elasticized undergarments from the long line corselet to the lighter panty girdle designed for younger or more slender women, was worn by the overwhelming majority of American women throughout the period. Surveys conducted by the foundation garment industry in the mid-1950s suggested that approximately 90% of women over the age of 30 wore some form of girdle as a matter of daily routine, and the garments were sold by Warner's, Playtex, Form-Fit, and Maidenform in quantities that reflected this near-universal adoption. Maidenform had launched its I Dream campaign in 1949, building a long-running series of advertisements around the image of a woman performing various confident public actions, attending a concert, exploring a foreign city, conducting a business meeting, while dressed only in her Maidenform brassiere and conventional clothing below the waist. The campaign ran continuously through the 1960s and served, in its way, as both an advertisement for a specific product and a cultural argument about the relationship between foundation garments and feminine confidence. The structured brassiere, with its engineering precisely designed to produce a particular silhouette, the pointed, conical shape often described in retrospect as the bullet bra, was as much a component of the expected feminine appearance as any element of the cosmetic routine. The shirtwaist dress was the garment in which this carefully assembled appearance was most commonly encased during the domestic workday. Christian Dior's New Look, presented in Paris in February of 1947 and characterized by its dramatically cinched waist, its padded hips, and its full skirt falling to mid-calf, had filtered to the levels of the fashion industry with considerable speed, and by the early 1950s, its essential silhouette had been adapted into a mass-market shirtwaist dress. A button-front cotton or synthetic dress with a fitted bodice and a full or semi-full skirt that appeared in the pattern books of Simplicity and Butterick and on the racks of Sears Roebuck and Montgomery Ward. The shirtwaist was a garment in which millions of American housewives spent their working days, and it was considered by the standards of the period the appropriate default dress for a woman managing a household. More polished than the house dress worn by an older generation, less formal than the suits and dresses worn for social occasions. The wearing of flat shoes with such a dress was widely described in fashion columns as slovenly or careless. The kitten heel or modest pump was the expected accompaniment, even for a day spent managing children, scrubbing floors, and operating a washing machine. This expectation that a woman should perform physically demanding domestic labor in clothing and footwear designed for a rather different set of activities was not generally recognized in the advice literature as a tension or a paradox. The maintenance of appearance during the course of domestic work was addressed, where it was addressed at all, as a management problem amenable to practical solutions rather than as an inherent contradiction. The wearing of an apron over the good dress was a standard recommendation, protecting the fabric during cooking and cleaning while leaving the dress itself intact for presentation. Rubber gloves were strongly advised for dishwashing and the application of cleaning products, and the advice literature on this subject was particularly emphatic because the hands were a recurring site of cosmetic anxiety for housewives of the period. Jergens lotion, which had been selling its hand cream to American women since the 1890s, built much of its 1950s advertising around the premise that a woman engaged in domestic work was in constant danger of dry, reddened, or roughened hands that would betray her labor and undermine her appearance. The implication was not that the labor was too demanding for the body performing it, but that the body should be managed and maintained so as to show no evidence of the demands made upon it. The beauty parlor functioned, in the suburban communities of the 1950s, as a significant social institution as well as a commercial service. The weekly appointment for a shampoo and set, during which the wet hair was wound around rollers or shaped into pin curls, dried under a hooded dryer, and then brushed or combed out into the controlled waves and smooth surfaces that the period required, was a routine shared by women across the economic range of suburban middle class. The appointment was at once a maintenance procedure and a social occasion. The beauty parlor was one of the few spaces in the domestic week in which women gathered without the organizing purpose of a children's activity or a formal civic function. Eugene Permanent Wave Equipment Company and other manufacturers of professional salon equipment had supplied the growing suburban salon economy with the heated dryers, the setting tools, and the permanent wave apparatus that the industry required. And by the middle of the decade, there were approximately 150,000 licensed beauty salons operating across the United States, the majority of them small establishments, serving the surrounding residential neighborhood. For women who did not maintain a weekly salon appointment, the Home Permanent Wave Kit, sold under the Tony brand with the advertising campaign built around the question of which twin had professionally done wave, offered a domestic alternative that brought the language and aspiration of the salon into the household. The structural paradox at the center of all of this was not subtle, though it was rarely acknowledged directly in the culture that created it. The post-war housewife was expected to present at all times and under all conditions an appearance of composed, maintained femininity, an appearance that required considerable daily effort, specific products, practice technique, and a not insignificant expenditure of time. She was simultaneously expected to perform a volume of physical domestic labor, cleaning, cooking, laundering, childcare that constituted, by the estimate of home economists who studied the question in the early 1950s, the equivalent of a full-time industrial job. The reconciliation of these two demands, the demand for a visible feminine beauty that showed no signs of physical effort, and the demand for a physical labor output that would have exhausted a person not simultaneously maintaining that beauty, was simply assumed, in the advice literature, to be achievable through sufficient organization, discipline, and care. The woman who failed to achieve it was not understood to be caught in an impossible situation. She was understood to be insufficiently devoted. The domestic day that followed this carefully managed morning had its own detailed architecture, prescribed in texts and time-use studies with thoroughness that treated the hours between breakfast and the husband's return from work as a professional workday, one that required planning, system, and continuous physical engagement, but that was nonetheless expected to leave no visible trace of effort by the time the evening began. The home economics movement had been accumulating institutional authority in the United States for the better part of a half-century, before the post-war suburban housewife found herself at the center of its attentions. Ellen Swallow Richards, a chemist who had been the first woman admitted to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, had in the 1890s articulated the founding proposition of a discipline, that the management of a household was not a natural talent passed between generations of women through informal observation, but a science, subject to the same principles of systematic study and professional training as any other field of applied knowledge. Richards called this science euthenics, defining it as a science of controllable environment, and she organized the first Lake Placid Conference on Home Economics in 1900 to begin the work of establishing curricula, standards, and professional associations that would carry the discipline into universities. By 1909, the American Home Economics Association had been formally constituted, with Richards as its first president. And within the following 2 decades, home economics programs have been established at Cornell University, Michigan State College, the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois, Pennsylvania State College, and most of the major land-grant institutions across the country. The Smith-Lever Act in 1914 had created the Cooperative Extension Service, which connected these university programs to the practical domestic lives of women in every county in the country through a system of county agents and published bulletins, and by the 1950s this infrastructure had been in continuous operation for 4 decades, representing one of the most sustained efforts in American history to bring scientific authority to bear on the management of private, domestic life. The Cornell University College of Home Economics, which occupied a cluster of buildings on the eastern edge of the university's Ithaca campus, was by the early 1950s the largest and most influential home economics program in the country. Its faculty conducted research on nutrition, child development, household management, and consumer economics, and its findings were disseminated not only through academic journals and textbooks, but through a continuous series of extension bulletins mailed directly to households across New York State. The bulletins, printed on coarse paper in a format designed for practical use rather than archival reading, covered subjects ranging from the proper temperature for pasteurizing home-canned vegetables to the most efficient sequence of tasks in a week's housework schedule. They were written in a register that combined the authority of the university with the practical directness of a knowledgeable neighbor, and they were read carefully by the women who received them, many of whom had no other access to the kind of technical domestic education that the home economics movement promised. Similar extension programs operated out of Michigan State, Kansas State, and the University of Tennessee, and together they constituted a network through which the standards developed in academic home economics laboratories were continuously translated into the expectations of ordinary domestic life. The time-use studies conducted by home economists during the 1940s and 1950s produced, as one of their central findings, a figure that has remained among the most cited statistics in the subsequent scholarship on American domesticity. Studies conducted at a range of institutions, including work by researchers at the Bureau of Home Economics within the United States Department of Agriculture, found that American housewives in the post-war period were spending between 50 and 55 hours per week on domestic labor, a figure essentially unchanged from time use studies conducted in the 1920s and 1930s, despite the introduction over the intervening decades of a significant range of mechanical appliances designed specifically to reduce that labor. Joan Van Eck, a sociologist at Queens College of the City University of New York, would later synthesize this data in a 1974 article published in Scientific American, demonstrating across a range of studies spanning 4 decades that the time women spent on housework had remained approximately constant even as the household's technological endowment had expanded dramatically. The explanation for this finding, one that will be developed most fully by the historian Ruth Schwartz Cowan of the State University of New York at Stony Brook in her 1983 book, More Work for Mother, was that the introduction of labor-saving appliances did not reduce the total demand on the housewife's time because it did not reduce the standards expected of the household. It raised them. The automatic washing machine provides the clearest illustration of this dynamic. The wringer washer, which had required the housewife to feed wet clothing through a mechanical roller to extract the water before hanging it to dry, had been replaced by the automatic washing machine at varying rates across the American housing stock during the 1940s and early 1950s. The Maytag Company, the Whirlpool Corporation, and the General Electric Company were all producing automatic washing machines by the early years of the decade, and the machines were sold through department stores, appliance dealers, and the pages of Good Housekeeping and House Beautiful with advertising that emphasized the liberation they offer from the most physically demanding element of the laundry routine. The advertising was not false. The automatic washer did eliminate the most arduous aspects of the washing process. But the consequence of this elimination was not a reduction in the hours devoted to laundry. It was an increase in the frequency with which laundry was expected to be done, and a corresponding increase in the standard of cleanliness expected of household linen and clothing. In the generation before the automatic washer, clothing had commonly been worn multiple times between washings, and bed linen had been changed weekly as a matter of course. By the middle of the 1950s, the expectation in a well-managed household was for bed linen to be changed and washed twice weekly, for children's clothing to be laundered after each wearing, and for the household supply of towels, dishcloths, and table linen to be maintained in a state of consistent whiteness that reflected the full capacity of the new machines. The machine had not produced less laundry. It had made more laundry not only possible, but expected. The same pattern operated across the other major domestic appliances of the period. The electric refrigerator, by then standard equipment in the overwhelming majority of American homes, made it possible to store fresh vegetables, fresh meat, and fresh dairy products for periods that the icebox in an earlier generation could not have managed, and the result was that the standard of the family's diet was revised upward accordingly. The housewife, who had once been expected to provide nutritionally adequate meals, was now expected to provide fresh, varied, and attractively presented meals that reflected the full range of ingredients her refrigerator made available. The Hotpoint division of General Electric and the Frigidaire division of General Motors were both producing refrigerators with expanded freezer compartments by the mid-1950s, and the marketing of these machines was built around images of abundant fresh food stored in a state of perfect organization. The glass shelves arranged with precision that suggested not the preservation of perishables, but the curation of a domestic larder. The Hoover Company's electric vacuum cleaner, which had been in domestic use since the 1910s, was by the 1950s available in a range of models sufficiently powerful and maneuverable to clean carpets, upholstered furniture, drapes, and ceiling corners with thoroughness that manual sweeping and beating had not approached, and the standard of domestic cleanliness had risen correspondingly to require precisely that thoroughness. The specific daily schedule that the advice literature and the extension service bulletins recommended reflected, in its cumulative demands, the full weight of these raised standards. The morning began, following the personal preparation already described, with the preparation of breakfast and its aftermath. In a household with children of school age, this meant the preparation of a cooked breakfast, the serving and management of the meal, and the cleaning of the kitchen, which the extension bulletin specified should be completed before any other household task was begun. The beds were to be made immediately after the breakfast dishes were washed and put away, with hospital corners on the sheets and pillows arranged with care that several advice features described in terms suggesting the aesthetic standards of a hotel rather than those of a private home. The general tidying of the living areas followed. The straightening of cushions, the emptying of ashtrays, the collection of any objects displaced from their designated positions during the previous evening. All of this was to be completed by approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, at which point the substantive cleaning tasks of the day could begin. The Cornell Extension bulletins recommended a weekly cleaning rotation in which each room of the house received a thorough cleaning on its designated day, supplemented by the daily surface maintenance that preserved the house's presentable condition between the weekly cleanings. Monday was, by the nearly universal consensus of the domestic advice tradition, laundry day, a designation whose origins predated the washing machine and that the washing machine had not displaced. Tuesday was for ironing, a task that the automatic washer had reduced but not eliminated, and that in a household with young children involved a quantity of children's clothing, household linen, and the husband's dress shirts that required several hours of sustained work. Wednesday was designated for mending and sewing, tasks that were expected to be performed with a skill level that implied at least a basic knowledge of the domestic sewing machine. The Singer Manufacturing Company, which had been selling domestic sewing machines since the 1850s, was in the 1950s marketing its machine specifically to the housewife who made her own and her children's clothing as a matter of domestic economy and pride. Thursday and Friday were allocated to the more intensive cleaning tasks. The scrubbing of floors, the washing of windows, the cleaning of bathroom fixtures with cleaners that the Procter & Gamble Company and the Colgate-Palmolive Company had been refining and promoting throughout the decade. Saturday was reserved for the marketing, a task that the postwar suburban geography had redefined. Where an earlier generation of urban housewives had purchased food daily from nearby shops, the suburban housewife was expected to manage a weekly grocery run to the supermarket, which in communities like Levittown and Park Forest typically meant a drive of several miles and the management of a purchases list that provisioned the household for 7 days. The supermarket itself was a post-war institution in its maturity. The Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, known as the A&P, have been operating large grocery stores since the early 20th century, but the full development of the modern supermarket, the single large format store with dedicated departments for produce, meat, dairy, and packaged goods, accessible primarily by automobile, had accelerated dramatically in the post-war suburban expansion. The King Cullen Company in New York, the Safeway stores chain operating on the West Coast, and the Kroger Company in the Midwest were all expanding their suburban locations throughout the decade, and the stores were designed and stocked with detailed understanding of how the housewife would navigate them. The application of lighting, display, and product placement to the management of shopping behavior was by the mid-1950s a recognized commercial discipline, and the housewife moving to the aisles of a modern supermarket was moving to a space engineered at every point to encourage her to spend more time and more money than her list required. The frozen food section, which had expanded substantially with the introduction of the Swanson TV dinner in 1953, offered a product category that promised to reduce meal preparation time, though the advice literature of the period treated frozen and packaged convenience foods with considerable ambivalence, suggesting that their regular use implied insufficient dedication to the household's nutritional welfare. The kitchen was a room in which the domestic day was most continuously centered. It was also the room in which the industrial and academic effort to manage and improve the housewife's labor was most fully expressed. Lillian Gilbreth, an industrial engineer who had applied the time and motion study methods developed in the factory to the management of household work, had in the 1930s and 1940s produced a series of kitchen design recommendations that had influenced the layout of kitchens in American homes built since the late 1930s. Gilbert's work was concerned primarily with the elimination of unnecessary steps. She measured the distances a housewife walked during the preparation of a meal, the number of times she opened and closed a refrigerator, the frequency with which items were moved from one location to another, and her recommendations for the placement of appliances, work surfaces, and storage in the kitchen were adopted in simplified form by the architects and builders of the post-war housing developments. The kitchen in a 1950s ranch house was a considerably more ergonomically rational workspace than the kitchen in a Victorian farmhouse, and the home economics literature described this as an unambiguous improvement in the housewife's working conditions. The preparation of the evening meal was a domestic task that attracted the most sustained attention from the advice literature, and this was consistent with his position in the logic of the household. It was a meal that was consumed in the husband's presence and by which his assessment of the household's domestic management was most directly formed, and it was therefore the meal whose quality carried the most social and relational weight. The advice columns of Good Housekeeping and McCall's, the extension bulletins from Cornell and Michigan State, and the recipe columns of House Beautiful were all in agreement that the evening meal should consist of multiple courses. At minimum, a main course accompanied by 2 vegetables, a starch, and a salad, and should be presented at the table with an attention to appearance that encompassed the arrangement of the food on the platter, the folding of the napkins, and the visual coordination of the table setting. Irma Rombauer's The Joy of Cooking, first published in 1931 and reissued in a substantially revised edition in 1952, was a standard reference work in the American kitchen of the period, and its 1952 edition had been expanded to nearly 900 pages to accommodate the range of dishes and techniques that the post-war American kitchen was expected to be capable of producing. James Beard, who had been writing and teaching about American cooking since the 1940s, was by the mid-1950s a recognized authority whose syndicated columns and books reinforced the expectation that a well-managed household maintained a repertoire of dishes sufficiently varied to prevent repetition over the course of a week. The cumulative picture assembled from the time-use studies, the extension bulletins, the advice columns, and the academic home economics literature was one of a working day that exceeded, in its total hours and in its continuous demands on physical energy and mental attention, the working day of most men employed in the offices and factories of the post-war economy. The housewife who managed her day as the literature specified, rising early enough to complete her personal preparation before the household woke, producing a cooked breakfast, making the beds, cleaning the kitchen, working through the daily and weekly cleaning rotation, shopping, doing the laundry, preparing the evening meal, and maintaining throughout a physical appearance and emotional composure that gave no visible indication of the labor that had produced it, was performing work of genuine complexity and considerable physical demand. The advice literature did not acknowledge this as demanding. It presented it as a natural occupation of a woman who had organized her time correctly and approached her work with an appropriate sense of its importance. The woman who found the work exhausting was, by the logic of the same literature, a woman who had not yet mastered it. The domestic day ended or was supposed to end in the same register of composed presentation in which it had begun. The house in order, the meal prepared, the woman herself as carefully assembled as she had been at 6 in the morning. What the literature did not address, at least not directly, was what was expected of that woman when, having achieved the state of domestic order, she turned her attention to the social life of the neighborhood, which carried its own set of obligations as exacting as anything encountered in the domestic routine. The social life of the post-war suburban neighborhood was not, in the understanding of those who participated in it, a leisure activity distinguishable from the other obligations of a domestic week. It was a distinct category of domestic labor, governed by its own set of rules, evaluated by its own standards, and carrying consequences for failure that were as concrete and as lasting as those produced by a poorly maintained house or an inadequately prepared meal. The coffee klatch, the bridge club, the formal dinner party, the PTA meeting, the neighborhood welcome for a newly arrived family, each of these had its established protocols, and the woman who navigated them with consistent competence was understood to be performing one of the essential functions of the housewife's professional role. The woman who navigated them poorly, or who failed to participate in them at all, was understood to be failing at something rather more significant than a personal preference. She was failing at the part of her work that was most directly visible to the community in which she lived. The etiquette literature of the period was the primary codification of the social system, and was a body of writing of considerable volume and remarkable specificity. Emily Post, whose Blue Book of Social Usage had first appeared in 1922 and had been through 9 revised editions by 1955, remained the most widely recognized name in American etiquette, though her authority had been substantially challenged and in some circles eclipsed by the publication in 1952 of Amy Vanderbilt's Complete Book of Etiquette, A Guide to Gracious Living. Vanderbilt's book ran to 685 pages in its first edition, published by Doubleday and Company in New York, and it addressed a full range of social occasions that an American woman of the post-war middle class might expect to encounter, from the informal morning coffee gathering to the formal seated dinner party, to the protocols surrounding birth announcements, christenings, coming-of-age celebrations, weddings, and funerals. The book sold over 500,000 copies within its first 3 years of publication, and was found on the shelves of houses in Levittown and Park Forest and Lakewood alongside the women's magazines and the home economics bulletins. Consulted before parties with the same purposeful practicality with which a recipe book was consulted before a meal. Vanderbilt's approach to the question of domestic entertaining was systematic in its detail. She specified the correct wording of written invitations for occasions of varying formality, distinguishing between the engraved third-person invitation appropriate for a seated dinner of 8 or more and an informal written note acceptable for a smaller luncheon or a cocktail gathering. She addressed the correct response time for such invitations: 3 days for a formal occasion, a shorter interval for informal ones, and a precise language to be used in an acceptance or regret. The physical setting of the table received extended treatment. Vanderbilt specified the placement of flatware in relation to plate, working from the outside toward the center in the sequence in which each piece would be used, with the fish fork positioned to the outside of the dinner fork, the salad fork to the inside, the dessert utensils placed horizontally above the plate rather than on its sides. Glasses were to be positioned above and to the right of the plate, with the water glass closest to the center and the wine glasses arranged in a line extending toward the outer right edge of the place setting, in the sequence in which they would be used during the meal. Place cards, Vanderbilt specified, were appropriate for any gathering of 8 or more, and the arrangement of guests at the table was governed by a set of social precedences, by age, by social prominence, by gender alternation, that required a hostess to have given serious advanced thought to the composition of her guest list before she could complete the table plan. Emily Post, in the 1955 edition of her Etiquette, addressed the question of the cocktail hour with a precision that reflected the period's ambivalence about alcohol as a domestic social institution. The cocktail party had become, in the post-war suburban community, one of the primary formats for social entertaining, and post-treatment of it acknowledged its prevalence while carefully managing the standards it was expected to meet. A cocktail party, in post-formulation, was appropriate as a standalone social occasion or as a preliminary hour before a dinner party, and it was to be organized with the same attention to detail as a seated meal. The host or hosts were to be present at the entrance to receive each arriving guest. The cocktails were to be prepared and offered promptly. The accompanying food, which Post described in terms of small, well-executed items that complemented rather than replaced a meal to follow, was to be plentiful but not so substantial as to imply that no dinner invitation would be forthcoming. The number of cocktails served before a dinner was, in the etiquette literature, a matter of quiet social management. Too few suggested inhospitality. Too many suggested an approach to the evening that Post and Vanderbilt both characterized with restrained disapproval. The standard was to offer over approximately 45 minutes, with a move to the table following promptly on the second. The morning coffee gathering, known variously as a coffee klatsch, from the German Kaffeeklatsch, or simply as a morning coffee, was the most frequent and least formal of the social rituals embedded in the suburban housewives' week. It occurred typically on 2 or 3 mornings per week, rotating among the houses of a small group of neighboring women, and it served a social function that was understood by participants as simultaneously personal and communal. The coffee was offered in the good cups rather than the everyday ones, and was accompanied by something baked: a coffee cake, a quick bread, a plate of cookies whose recipe a guest might be asked to share, and whose quality was registered, with a social awareness that the informal setting did not diminish. The conversation at these gatherings covered household management, children's development, neighborhood news, and the assessment of the social performance of those not present, and the information exchanged and the impressions formed over these morning cups were among the primary instruments through which a neighborhood's social hierarchy was maintained and adjusted. A woman new to the neighborhood who failed to attend when invited, or who attended but brought inadequate refreshment when it was her turn to host, or who was found to maintain standards of household management below those of the group, was not corrected or criticized directly. She was simply, over time, invited less frequently, and the consequences of that reduction in invitation were not subtle. William H. White, a writer and organizational theorist who spent considerable time during the early 1950s observing life in Park Forest, Illinois, the planned community of row houses and garden apartments that had been built 30 miles south of Chicago to house young families of the expanding corporate class, documented the social system in his 1956 book, The Organization Man, with a clarity that the participants might not have recognized in themselves. White described the social life of Park Forest as organized around a set of overlapping obligations: the block unit, the court, the larger neighborhood, that create a nearly total social environment for the women who manage the households while their husbands commute to the city or to the regional corporate offices. He observed that participation in the community's social institutions, the coffee groups, the evening couples gatherings, the civic organizations, the church activities, was not experienced as optional, and that women who withdrew from this participation, for whatever reason, found themselves exposed to social pressure that was all the more effective for being entirely informal. No one told a woman in Park Forest that she was expected to participate in her court's social life. The expectation was simply ambient, a condition of the environment rather than an explicit rule, and its enforcement was accordingly diffuse and difficult to contest. White's analysis extended the question of the corporate wife as an extension of her husband's organizational identity, and this extension gave the suburban housewife social performance a professional dimension that the advice literature had long implied but rarely stated as directly as White did. In the post-war corporate culture, a husband's advancement within his organization was understood by personnel departments and by the informal judgments of senior management to be affected by the social competence and personal presentation of his wife. White quoted a personnel officer at a major manufacturing corporation who described the evaluation of a candidate's wife as a routine element of the promotion assessment, noting that a wife who was socially awkward or who failed to maintain appropriate standards of dress and domestic management, or who expressed opinions that marked her as unconventional or difficult, could be a meaningful obstacle to her husband's career progress. The wife's performance at the company dinner, the company picnic, the evening gathering at the regional manager's house, these occasions were understood by both parties to be professional events in which the wife was functioning as a representative of her household's adequacy and of her husband's capacity to manage it. The domestic performance delivered in the privacy of the suburban home was, in this understanding, continuous with the corporate performance delivered in the public settings of the husband's professional life. Herbert Gans, a sociologist who moved with his wife into Levittown, New Jersey in the autumn of 1958 to conduct a fieldwork that would eventually produce his 1967 study, The Levittowners, documented the social organization of that community with the same empirical attention that White had brought to Park Forest. Gans observed that the social structure of Levittown organized itself with remarkable speed after the community's establishment. Within months of their arrival, residents had formed block associations, church groups, civic organizations, and informal social clusters that replicated in the new suburban setting the social institutions of the urban and rural communities from which the residents had come. The women who managed the Levittown households were, as Gans noted, the primary architects of the social structure, because they were present in the community throughout the working day while their husbands were absent, and the relationships they built with neighboring women formed the foundation on which the broader community's social life was constructed. The quality of these relationships was, in Gans's observation, closely tied to quality of a woman's domestic performance. A neighbor whose house was well maintained, whose children were adequately managed, and who participated reliably in the reciprocal social obligations of block was a neighbor whose company was sought. A neighbor who fell short on any of these measures was a neighbor whose company was gradually dispensed with. The formal dinner party occupied the apex of the suburban social hierarchy, and its execution required a standard of preparation that distinguished it from the other domestic entertainments of the week in its demands on both skill and resource. Amy Vanderbilt devoted a substantial portion of her complete book of etiquette to the formal dinner, specifying the sequence of courses, the appropriate wines to accompany each course, the timing of the service, the behavior of the host and hostess during the meal, and the protocol governing the after-dinner period, in which the guests would be moved through a sequence of social stages: coffee in the living room conversation, and a carefully managed conclusion to the evening that reflected the hostess's command of the occasion's social architecture. The preparation of formal dinner for 8 guests, the minimum number that Vanderbilt considered sufficient to justify the designation formal, required the housewife to have solved, in advance, an interlocking set of logistical problems: the composition of the menu, the sourcing of the ingredients, the preparation of any dishes that could be made the day before, the arrangement of the table, the selection of the appropriate linen and flatware, the chilling of the wines, the preparation of the cocktail hour, and the management of the cooking sequence on the evening itself, so that each course was ready at the correct moment without the hostess's absence from her guests being either prolonged or apparent. The Junior League, a women's volunteer organization that had been founded in New York City in 1901 by Mary Harriman, and that by the mid-1950s maintained chapters in most American cities of any size, provided one of the formal frameworks within which the suburban housewife social performance was assessed and ranked. Membership in the Junior League was by invitation and was understood to represent a specific level of social standing. The organization's training programs in volunteer work and civic engagement were considered secondary in the social understanding of its members, to the signal that membership itself transmitted about a woman's family background, social connections, and personal conduct. The League of Women Voters, which had been founded in 1920 by Carrie Chapman Catt, and whose chapters operated in most suburban communities by the mid-1950s, provided a parallel social framework with civic rather than social emphasis, though the two organizations drew from overlapping membership pools, and participation in both was understood in many communities as a marker of serious domestic citizenship. The Welcome Wagon, a commercial service that had been operating since its founding in 1928 by Thomas Briggs of Memphis, Tennessee, and that by the 1950s was active in communities across the country, serve as one of the primary mechanisms through which the social expectations of a new neighborhood were communicated to its arriving residents. The Welcome Wagon hostess, a local woman who worked for the organization on a part-time basis, called on newly arrived families within their first weeks in the community, bringing a basket of coupons and samples from local merchants and delivering, alongside this commercial content, a detailed briefing on the community's social institutions, its civic organizations, its church affiliations, and the informal norms governing neighborhood conduct. The social education the Welcome Wagon delivered was in part explicit and in part demonstrative. The hostess herself, in her presentation and manner, embodied the standard that the new resident was expected to meet. Her arrival was understood as a social assessment as much as a social welcome. The Bridge Club, which typically comprised 4 women meeting weekly on a rotating basis at each member's home, combined the social functions of the coffee klatch, the reciprocal hosting, the assessment of standards, the maintenance of neighborhood relationships, with the added dimension of a shared competitive activity that gave the gathering an organizational purpose and a temporal structure. Bridge was the dominant card game of the American middle class during the 1940s and 1950s, and its popularity was inseparable from its social function. It provided a format in which 4 women could spend 2 to 3 hours together in a context that had both a defined beginning and a defined end, that required sufficient mental engagement to sustain conversation without demanding the kind of sustained creative work that might have challenged the domestic register of the occasion. The refreshments served at a Bridge gathering were expected to reflect the same standard of quality and presentation as those served at the morning coffee, with the additional light lunch of the gathering extended into the midday hours, and the rotation of hosting duties meant that a woman's domestic standards were on display before her closest neighbors at regular intervals throughout the year. The Parent-Teacher Association, which had been organized at the national level since its founding in 1897 by Alice McClellan Burney and Phoebe Apperson Hearst, and which maintained active chapters in the elementary and secondary schools of every suburban community in the country, provided a third major axis of organized social participation in the domestic life of a 1950s housewife. Attendance at PTA meetings, participation in its fundraising activities, and the assumption of committee responsibilities within its structure were understood as civic obligations in the same register as church attendance and voter registration. And the social assessment of a woman's participation in the PDA was not wholly distinct from the assessment of her participation in the neighborhood's informal social life. A woman who attended PDA meetings but sat at the back and offered no comment was marking herself as insufficiently engaged. A woman who assumed committee responsibilities and executed them competently was marking herself as a reliable participant in the community's shared project of institutional maintenance. A woman who assumed responsibilities and failed to execute them was marking herself in a way that was both specific and durable. The totality of these social obligations, the coffee gatherings, the bridge clubs, the formal dinner parties, the junior league activities, the PDA committees, the welcome wagon protocol, the management of the neighborhood's informal social calendar, did not present itself to the women performing them as an external burden imposed from outside their domestic lives. It presented itself as the social dimension of those lives, as natural and as essential as the cleaning of the house or the preparation of the meals. The sociological analysis of William H. White and Herbert Gans could observe the system from outside and describe the mechanisms by which its conformity was maintained. But the women inside the system, for the most part, experienced its obligations not as conformity, but as community. The distinction between these two understandings, one available to the outside observer, one available to the participant, is among the more delicate observations to be made about this period of American domestic life, and it matters to what happened next, which was that the weight of these obligations accumulated across the domestic day and the domestic week and the domestic year began to produce in the women carrying them a specific variety of distress that the medical profession would attempt to address with pharmaceutical tools before it attempted to understand the distress's social origins. The distress was not invisible, and it was not new. Women living within the domestic system described in the advice literature of the period had been communicating their unhappiness to their physicians, their clergymen, their mothers, and occasionally their husbands for years before the medical profession assembled a coherent account of what was observing. The communications took a variety of forms. Some were explicit. A woman sitting in her general practitioner's consulting room, describing persistent fatigue, difficulty sleeping, a pervasive sense of flatness or emptiness that she could not attach to any specific cause. Others were more oblique, a pattern of minor physical complaints, recurring headaches, digestive disturbances, a generalized somatic language through which an emotional condition expressed itself in the only terms that the surrounding culture made available. In either case, the physician who received these communications in the 1950s was working within a diagnostic framework that understood the unhappy housewife not as a person responding rationally to an unreasonable situation, but as a person whose internal psychological mechanisms had failed to make the necessary accommodation to her natural and proper social role. Betty Friedan, who had graduated from Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts in 1942, and had worked briefly as a journalist before marrying and moving to the suburban community of Rockland County, New York, began in 1957 to conduct a survey of her Smith College classmates in preparation for their 15th reunion. The survey was intended to measure the degree to which her classmates had achieved the domestic satisfaction that the prevailing cultural ideology promised, and what it found instead was a pattern of quiet desperation so uniform and so widespread that Friedan spent the following 5 years investigating its dimensions and its causes. The book that resulted, The Feminine Mystique, published in February of 1963 by W. Norton and Company, opened with a chapter that described what Friedan called a problem that has no name, a formless, nameless malaise that she had encountered in household after household, in her survey responses and in subsequent interviews, a dissatisfaction that the women experiencing it found nearly impossible to articulate because the cultural language available to them contained no adequate description of it. As Friedan wrote, each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownie troops, lay beside her husband at night, and was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? The Feminine Mystique would eventually sell over 3 million copies, and is frequently cited as one of the catalysts for the second wave of the American feminist movement. But in the years before its publication, the distress it documented had been processed not as a political or social condition, but as a medical one. Mira Komarovsky, a sociologist at Barnard College in New York City, who had published Women, in the Modern World in 1953, had documented in that book and in her subsequent research a pattern of intellectual frustration and social constriction among college-educated women who had moved into full-time domesticity after graduation. Komarovsky's findings were careful and empirically grounded, and they raised, in the measured language of academic sociology, questions about the relationship between female education, domestic expectation, and psychological welfare that the dominant clinical and cultural frameworks of the period were not well positioned to answer. Her 1964 study, Blue Collar Marriage, based on fieldwork conducted in a working-class community she called Glenton, found the same pattern of constrained communication, emotional isolation, and suppressed dissatisfaction among women without college education who were living within the domestic system's expectations at a lower economic register. The unhappiness Komarovsky documented was not, her data suggested, a function of education or class. It was more broadly distributed than that. The psychiatric profession's engagement with this unhappiness in the 1950s was shaped by a diagnostic vocabulary inherited substantially from the work of Helene Deutsch, a Viennese psychoanalyst who had trained under Sigmund Freud in the 1910s and 20s, and whose two-volume work, The Psychology of Women, published in English in 1944 and 1945, had become a foundational text in American psychiatric training. Deutsch's framework understood femininity as defined by three essential psychological characteristics: narcissism, passivity, and masochism. In her formulation, the psychologically healthy woman was one who had successfully resolved the developmental challenges of her sex by accepting and embracing these characteristics as a natural expression of her female identity. A woman who resisted passivity, who sought intellectual achievement, professional independence, or a social role extending beyond the domestic sphere, was understood, within Deutsch's framework, to be exhibiting a psychological dysfunction, a failure to achieve a normal feminine resolution. This framework provided the clinical foundation for the tendency of mid-century psychiatry to treat women's unhappiness within the domestic role as evidence of internal maladjustment rather than of external constraint. The distress was real, only its origin was misidentified. The first diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952, offered a diagnostic category of psychoneurotic reaction that was applied with considerable frequency to women presenting with the symptoms Friedan would later describe: anxiety, fatigue, emotional flatness, a persistent inability to find meaning or satisfaction in the activities of the domestic day. The diagnosis placed the problem in the woman's psychological functioning rather than in her circumstances, and the treatment it implied was accordingly directed at adjusting the woman's response to her situation rather than the situation itself. Psychotherapy was available to women whose husbands could afford its costs and whose physicians thought appropriate, but the provision of psychiatric outpatient treatment was inconsistent across the American housing geography of the 1950s. And in many suburban communities, there were no practicing psychiatrists within a reasonable distance of the household. The general practitioner, seeing a woman in his consulting room who described fatigue and anxiety and a general inability to cope with the demands of her domestic day, was working at the edge of his training, and when the pharmaceutical industry provided him, in the middle years of the decade, with a tool that appeared to address these symptoms directly and rapidly, he used it. The tool arrived in the form of meprobamate, a compound developed by Frank Berger, a Czechoslovakian-born pharmacologist working at Carter Products, a pharmaceutical company with offices in Cranbury, New Jersey, and his colleague William Bradley. Berger had been working on muscle relaxants since the late 1940s and had observed in his research that certain compounds produced a tranquilizing effect in animal subjects, a reduction in anxiety-related behavior, without the sedation produced by the barbiturates then in common use. Meprobamate was the most promising of these compounds, and Carter Products submitted it for approval to United States Food and Drug Administration, which granted that approval in May of 1955. The drug was marketed under the brand name Milltown, named after the small New Jersey township of Milltown near Carter's research facilities, and it was also sold under the brand name Equinal by Wyeth Laboratories, which had licensed a compound from Carter. The adoption of Milltown by the American medical community and rapidly thereafter by American popular culture was without precedent in the history of pharmaceutical marketing. Within 12 months of its approval, The drug had become one of the most widely prescribed medications in the United States, and physicians were writing prescriptions for it at a rate that quickly strained the manufacturing capacity of the facilities producing it. By the end of 1956, Americans were consuming approximately 35 million Miltown tablets per month, a figure that represented not occasional use, but something approaching routine daily consumption for a substantial portion of the adult population. The popular press gave the drug a cultural prominence that no prescription medication had previously achieved. Columnists wrote about it. Celebrities discussed it openly. And the social practice of offering a guest a Miltown tablet at a cocktail party, referred in the period's argot as a don't give a damn pill, was documented in the social columns of newspapers in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago. The actor Milton Berle, who performed on NBC television under the nickname Uncle Milty, began referring to himself in his nightclub act as Miltown Berle, a joke whose repetition suggested the degree to which the drug had penetrated the collective awareness. The population consuming Miltown was not, however, distributed evenly across the American demographic. Studies conducted in the late 1950s and early 1960s on prescription patterns consistently found that women were receiving tranquilizer prescriptions at approximately twice the rate of men, and that the primary clinical context in which women were being prescribed the drug was a general practitioner's consulting room rather than the specialist's office or the hospital ward. The advertising placed by Carter Products and Wyeth Laboratories in the American medical journals of the period, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the American Journal of Psychiatry, and the medical trade publications read by general practitioners, made the drug's intended female market explicit. The advertisements depicted anxious women in domestic settings, a woman standing at a kitchen sink, a woman sitting alone at a living room table, a woman holding a crying infant, accompanied by clinical language describing the symptoms of psychoneurotic anxiety and the relief that the advertised compound provided. The domestic setting was not incidental to the advertisement's argument. It was its central visual proposition. This is where the problem presents itself, and this is where the medication resolves it. Leo Sternbach, a chemist working at the Hoffman La Roche Pharmaceutical Company in Nutley, New Jersey, had been investigating a family of chemical compounds known as benzodiazepines since the mid-1950s. And in 1957, he identified a compound in this family that demonstrated anxiolytic properties, substantially stronger than those of meprobamate. Hoffman La Roche submitted the compound, which they named chlordiazepoxide and marketed under the brand name Librium, for Food and Drug Administration approval, and the approval was granted in 1960. Sternbach subsequently identified a related compound, diazepam, which proved more potent still, and Hoffman La Roche introduced it under the brand name Valium in 1963. Valium would become, within the following decade, the most prescribed pharmaceutical in the United States, with physicians writing approximately 60 million prescriptions for it annually by the mid-1970s, and the majority of those prescriptions were written for women. The cultural documentation of this pharmacological phenomenon arrived most vividly not in the academic literature, but in a song released in June of 1966 by the Rolling Stones on their album Aftermath. Written by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, the song was titled Mother's Little Helper and described, in the deadpan register of a character study rather than polemic, the daily life of a middle-aged housewife who required a small yellow pill to manage the passage of the domestic day. The pill helped her on her way, got her through her busy dying day, as the lyric put it. The song's tone was one of flat observation rather than sympathy or critique. It presented the tranquilizer-dependent housewife not as an exceptional case or a cautionary example, but as an ordinary figure whose condition was familiar enough to constitute a recognizable type. That the Rolling Stones, a British rock group whose primary audience was adolescent and young adult, had written this song at all, and that it had found, upon its release, an audience that immediately understood its subject, suggested that the pharmacological management of the post-war housewife's distress had by the mid-1960s become sufficiently widespread to be available as a cultural reference point across generational and social lines. The medical profession's understanding of the condition it was treating with these compounds was, throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, organized primarily around the concept of what psychiatrists called involutional melancholia, a diagnostic category describing a depressive state associated in women with the hormonal changes of the middle years. typically between the ages of 40 and 60, characterized by anxiety, agitation, insomnia, and a persistent sense of worthlessness or hopelessness. The category was listed in the first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and had been in use in American psychiatry since the early years of the 20th century, but its application in the 1950s was considerably broader than its formal definition implied. Women presenting with symptoms of anxiety and depression at ages well below the conventional menopausal range were frequently assigned diagnoses in its vicinity: psychoneurotic anxiety reaction, mass depression, reactive depression, that similarly located the problem in a woman's internal psychology rather than in her external circumstances. The treatments deployed for these conditions in the more severe cases extended well beyond prescription of tranquilizers. Electroconvulsive therapy, which had been developed by the Italian neurologists Ugo Cerletti and Lucio Bini in Rome in 1938, and had been introduced into American psychiatric practice in the early 1940s, was administered at a rate during the 1950s that would later attract considerable critical scrutiny. The procedure involved the application of electrical current to the patient's temples, inducing a controlled grand mal seizure under anesthesia, and it was used for a range of diagnoses that included involutional melancholia, severe depressive illness, and what contemporary records describe variously as nervous breakdown, hysteria, and chronic anxiety states. Women received electroconvulsive therapy at higher rates than men throughout the decade, and the procedure was administered in both hospital settings and in private psychiatric offices operating in the wealthier suburban communities and urban neighborhoods. Its effects on acute depressive symptoms were real and have been documented since its introduction, but the mechanism by which it produced those effects was not understood, and the condition of memory impairment that it produced as a consistent side effect was regarded in the clinical literature of the period as a minor and temporary inconvenience rather than as a significant harm. The prefrontal lobotomy, developed by the Portuguese neurologist Agos Moniz in the 1930s, and introduced into American practice by the neurologist Walter Freeman and the neurosurgeon James Watts at George Washington University Hospital in Washington in 1936, had by the early 1950s been refined by Freeman into what he called the transorbital lobotomy, a procedure performed by inserting a surgical instrument resembling an ice pick through the eye socket above the eyeball to sever the connections between the prefrontal cortex and the deeper structures of the brain. Freeman performed the transorbital procedure in his private practice, driving between hospitals and psychiatric institutions across the country in a vehicle he called the lobotomobile, and he had performed approximately 3,400 lobotomies in total before the procedure fell from medical favor in the late 1950s, with the arrival of the first effective antipsychotic medications. The women subjected to lobotomy during this period were, in a significant proportion of cases, women who had been admitted to psychiatric institutions for conditions that the clinical records described as chronic anxiety, persistent unhappiness, failure to adjust to domestic life, or refusal to perform household duties, categories whose clinical relationship to severe psychotic disorders for which the procedure had originally been intended was, at minimum, unclear. The pharmaceutical industry's advertising in the medical journals of the late 1950s and early 1960s documented, with inadvertent clarity, the understanding of housewives' distress that was organizing the medical response. A series of advertisements placed by Roche Laboratories for Librium in 1960 and 1961 depicted a young woman in a domestic setting, a woman surrounded by the physical artifacts of the housewife's day, and described the appropriate use of the product in language that treated the woman's anxiety not as a signal to be interpreted, but as a symptom to be suppressed. The advertisements addressed the prescribing physician, not the patient, and their argument was clinical in register. The patient was presented with anxiety. The anxiety was interfering with her functioning. The product would reduce the anxiety and restore the functioning. The question of what the anxiety might be responding to, what conditions in the patient's daily life might be generating it, was absent from the advertisement and, more broadly, from the clinical encounter it described. The pharmaceutical approach to the distress of the post-war housewife was not designed to ask that question. It was designed to make the question unnecessary. The deeper consequence of this medical framework was not only that it withheld from women in distress the understanding that their distress had social origins. It was that it communicated to those women, with the authority of the medical profession behind it, that the problem was in them, that the domestic system functioning perfectly adequately around them contained nothing that could reasonably account for what they were feeling, and that their failure to find peace and satisfaction within was a failure of their own psychological adequacy. For women already living within a cultural system that attributed every domestic shortcoming to personal inadequacy, this clinical confirmation arrived with particular kind of weight. The prescription filled at the pharmacy on the way home from the doctor's office was not experienced as a treatment for a social condition. It was experienced often as a private acknowledgement of personal failure, and was filled and refilled and filled again in the medicine cabinets of houses on streets in Nassau County and Park Forest and Lakewood, while outside the kitchen windows the neighborhood continued in its ordered way, and the obligations of the following morning waited quietly for the alarm clock to sound. The social system that organized domestic life in the post-war American suburb was not maintained primarily by explicit punishment. It was maintained by the continuous, low-level adjustment of social inclusion and exclusion that operated through the informal mechanisms of the neighborhood. The invitation extended or withheld, the greeting offered warmly or in a register of minimal courtesy, the information shared or quietly retained, the reputation built up over months of reliable participation in community life, or quietly dismantled by a pattern of absences and shortcomings. This adjustment process required no single enforcing authority and no formal procedure. It required only the normal social functioning of a community, whose members shared a comprehensive set of assumptions about how a household should be managed, a wife should present herself, and a neighbor should conduct her relationships with those around her. The woman who deviated from these assumptions did not, in most cases, find herself confronted directly or corrected explicitly. She found, instead, that the texture of her daily social environment had changed in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. The first category of deviation that attracted this response was a failure of domestic maintenance. The house that was visibly less clean or less orderly than those of its neighbors. The children who appeared in the street in clothing that showed insufficient care. The lawn that was not cut to the standard of the surrounding lots. The meal whose inadequacy became known through the indiscretion of a child or the unguarded comment of a husband at a neighborhood gathering. These failures were noted with social precision that was proportional to uniformity of the surrounding standard. In a neighborhood where every household maintained a comparable level of domestic management, a deviation from that level was conspicuous in a way that a single untuned instrument is conspicuous in an otherwise unified ensemble. It did not need to be pointed out. It was simply heard and remembered and incorporated into the assessment of the household that the neighborhood was continuously and mostly unconsciously conducting. The woman who worked outside the home occupied a more complex and, in some respects, more contested position in the social system than the woman who failed to maintain the domestic standard while remaining within it. The cultural ideology of the period held that a married woman's proper place was a household, and that a wife who sought paid employment outside, it was implicitly declaring that her husband was unable to provide adequately for family, a statement with direct consequences for the husband's standing in both the professional and his neighborhood community. Sociological surveys conducted during the decade found that approximately 1/4 of married women were employed in some form of paid work by the middle of the 1950s, a figure that represented a continuation of the gradual trend toward female labor force participation that had been building since the late 19th century, interrupted by the sharp wartime increase of the early 1940s and the subsequent cultural pressure toward domesticity in the years following the war. The women working in the mid-1950s were disproportionately concentrated in part-time, lower-wage occupations. Clerical work, retail sales, food service, domestic service for households wealthier than their own, and their earnings were typically framed, both in a household's own understanding and in the advice literature, as supplementary income rather than as the expression of a career. A woman who worked because she needed to, because her husband's income was insufficient to maintain the household at the level the neighborhood expected, occupied a position of quiet social embarrassment that the woman herself was expected to manage with discretion. A woman who worked because she wanted to, because she found a domestic routine insufficient to engage her abilities, or because she had cultivated a professional identity that she was unwilling to relinquish entirely upon marriage, occupied a position that the cultural ideology of the period defined as actively problematic. Ferdinand Lundberg and Mary Nia Farnham had addressed precisely this category of woman in their 1947 volume Modern Woman. the law sects, arguing that the professionally ambitious woman was not exercising a legitimate aspiration, but was exhibiting a flight from femininity whose psychological origins lay in an unresolved rejection of the female biological role. This framework provided a clinical language for a cultural prejudice that the neighborhood maintained without needing any clinical vocabulary. The working wife was suspected, with a persistence that no level of professional accomplishment could fully dispel, of having failed at something more important than whatever she was succeeding at in the office. The working wife's domestic obligations did not diminish in proportion to her hours outside the household. The advice literature of the period was essentially silent on the question of how a woman employed outside the home for 30 or 40 hours per week was expected to maintain the domestic standard described in its pages, and this silence was itself a form of answer. The standard was not revised downward for employed wives, and the husband's contribution to the household's domestic labor was not revised upward by the fact of his wife's employment. Studies of household labor distribution conducted during the late 1950s found that husbands in households where the wife was employed contributed an average of approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes per day to domestic tasks, a figure that represented no statistically significant increase over the contribution of husbands in households where the wife was not employed. The employed wife was accordingly performing 2 working days simultaneously, one in the office or shop, one in the household, and the domestic half of this double day was performed to the same standard as the domestic day of her non-employed neighbor, or she was understood, within the community's assessment, to be failing at one or the other. The consequences of marital failure, of the dissolution of the household through divorce, were, in the 1950s, of a severity that placed them in a category distinct from the ordinary social penalties of domestic inadequacy. Divorce was not common in this decade. The divorce rate, which had spiked sharply in 1946 as the returning servicemen and their hastily married wives renegotiated or dissolved wartime marriages, had declined to the late 1940s and settled by the early 1950s, at a figure of approximately 379,000 divorces per year in the United States, roughly 1 divorce for every 4 marriages contracted in the same year. This rate was considerably lower than it would become in the following 2 decades, and the cultural understanding of divorce in the mid-1950s reflected its relative rarity. It was not a normal occurrence, but an exceptional one, and the woman who was divorced was marked by that status in her community in ways from which recovery was slow and incomplete. The legal framework governing divorce in the 1950s operated on the principle of fault, which had been embedded in American domestic law since its earliest codification, and which required that one party to the divorce be identified as having committed a specific matrimonial offense: adultery, cruelty, abandonment, or in some states, habitual drunkenness or conviction of a felony, before the court could grant a dissolution of the marriage. A couple who had mutually agreed that their marriage had failed, and who wished to separate without the assignment of blame, had no direct legal mechanism available to them. They were required, if they wished to divorce, to construct a case that satisfied the fall criterion, often through the use of staged evidence or the collusion of private investigators, in proceedings that treated the dissolution of a private relationship as a matter of public adjudication. California enacted the first no-fault divorce statute in the United States in 1969, and the other states followed over the following decade. But throughout the 1950s, a woman seeking to leave a marriage was required to navigate a legal process that was adversarial, humiliating, and slow. The financial consequences of divorce for women in this period were severe and, for many, permanent. The married woman of the 1950s existed within a legal and financial framework that had been constructed around the assumption of permanent, economically dependent wifehood, and the dissolution of the marriage exposed the structural vulnerability of this assumption with a directness that the continuation of the marriage had kept invisible. A married woman could not, in most American states throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, obtain a bank loan in her own name without her husband's co-signature. She could not apply for a credit card without her husband's authorization. The major credit card companies of the period, including the Diners Club card introduced in 1950 and the American Express card introduced in 1958, issued their cards to married women only on the basis of their husband's creditworthiness, not their own. She could not obtain a mortgage in her own name, and in many states her husband was legally entitled to manage property that she had owned before the marriage or received through inheritance during it. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which prohibited discrimination in credit decisions on the basis of sex or marital status, was not enacted by the United States Congress until October 1974, a legislative gap of more than 2 decades after the period under examination here, during which the financial dependence of the married woman on her husband was a matter not of cultural preference, but of law. The divorced woman of the 1950s was accordingly a person who had lost, in the dissolution of her marriage, not only her social standing, but her primary mechanism for engaging with the formal economy. Alimony, the periodic support payment ordered by a court following a divorce, was available as a legal remedy, but it was inconsistently awarded, inconsistently paid, and practically very difficult to enforce in cases of non-payment. A divorced woman with children, without recent paid employment history, and without the ability to establish credit in her own name, was in a position of material precariousness that the social stigma of her divorce status made it difficult to address through remarriage, since the community's assessment of a divorced woman was not sympathetic. She was regarded by a social consensus that was not articulated as a policy, but that operated with the consistency of one, as a person who had failed at the central project of her adult life, and the pity and discomfort with which her neighbors responded to her presence in the community were not always distinguishable in their effects from contempt. Women who did not or could not conform to the domestic ideology of the period for reasons other than divorce encountered a different set of mechanisms designed to manage their deviation. The commitment of women to psychiatric institutions for conditions arising from their domestic circumstances was a practice that was, in the 1950s, both more common and more legally permissive than it would subsequently become. In most American states throughout the decade, a husband could authorize the involuntary psychiatric commitment of his wife without a judicial hearing, on the basis of physician certification that the woman was mentally ill, a category whose application, in cases involving unhappy or resistant wives, was sufficiently elastic to encompass a range of behaviors that later clinical and legal standards would not have supported. Women were admitted to state psychiatric institutions with diagnoses that included involutional melancholia, chronic anxiety reaction, schizophrenic reaction, and what hospital records in several documented cases described simply as refusal to perform household duties or inability to adjust to domestic life. The institutions to which they were admitted were, in many states, understaffed and undertreated, and the path from voluntary admission or involuntary commitment to discharge was neither short nor clearly defined. The experience of Sylvia Plath, the poet and novelist born in Boston, Massachusetts, in October 1932, has served in the subsequent cultural record as one of the most fully documented individual accounts of a young woman's encounter with the psychiatric system of this period. Plath had won a guest editorship at Mademoiselle magazine in New York City in the summer of 1953, an experience that placed her briefly at the intersection of professional ambition, cultural aspiration, and the domestic ideology of the women's magazine industry, and that she later described in the autobiographical novel she published in January of 1963 under the pseudonym Victoria Lucas, with the title The Bell Jar. Returning to her home in Wellesley, Massachusetts, after the month in New York, Plath found herself in a condition of acute psychological distress that culminated in a suicide attempt in August of 1953. She was admitted to McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts, one of the more well-resourced psychiatric facilities in the country, affiliated with Harvard Medical School, and she received there a course of treatment that included electroconvulsive therapy administered initially without adequate sedation, an experience she described in The Bell Jar in the language of electrical annihilation. She recovered, returned to Smith College, and graduated summa cum laude in June of 1955, a trajectory that the cultural narrative of the period would have described as a story of successful treatment and restoration to function. What the cultural narrative of the period could not easily accommodate was a recognition that Plath's distress, and the distress of the many women whose experiences were less fully documented than hers, was not separable from the system of expectations within which she had been living. The Bell Jar's account of its protagonist, Esther Greenwood, is in substantial part an account of a young woman confronting the narrow channel through which the culture of her time was prepared to direct her life, the channel that led, by the most direct route available, from education to marriage to suburban domestic day, and finding it insufficient. The novel was published in the United Kingdom in January of 1963, 2 weeks before Plath's death in London on February 11 of that year. It was not published in the United States under her own name until 1971, 8 years after her death, by which time the cultural conversation about the domestic ideology the novel described had been substantially altered by Betty Friedan's analysis and by the early activities of the women's liberation movement. But the experience the novel documented had taken place in 1953, at the height of the domestic ideology's cultural dominance, and its specificity as a historical record of that moment has not diminished with the passage of time. The women who fell outside the domestic system's terms, who divorced, who worked without apology, who expressed persistent unhappiness or unconventional ambition, who simply found themselves unable to maintain the required standard, were not, in the main, exceptional figures. They were women living within a system whose demands were, for a significant proportion of those subject to them, genuinely unsustainable, and their failures were less the product of individual inadequacy than the predictable consequences of expectations that had been constructed without reference to the actual range of human capacity, temperament, and circumstance. The social machinery that responded to their failures, the ostracism, the clinical diagnosis, the legal and financial penalties of the unhoused wife, was not designed with malicious intent. It was designed, rather, with a comprehensive indifference to the possibility that the system itself might be at fault, and this indifference was the more powerful for being so thoroughly shared, so deeply embedded in the institutional language of the period, that it required not a single act of deliberate cruelty to operate. It required only the ordinary functioning of ordinary social life, in ordinary houses on ordinary streets, in the pale autumn light of a decade that understood itself, with a confidence that history would not entirely ratify, to have achieved a nearly perfect arrangement of domestic order. By the late months of 1958, Betty Friedan had begun the interviews that would, over the following 4 years, accumulate into the evidence for feminine mystique. She was conducting them in houses that looked, from the outside, much like the houses described in every issue of Ladies' Home Journal and McCall's. The maintained lawns, the clean windows, the station wagons in the driveways. And what she found inside them was a generation of women who had been promised that the correct performance of the domestic role would produce a specific variety of fulfillment, and who had performed it with diligence and care, and found themselves, nonetheless, in a condition of quiet, persistent unhappiness that the cultural language available to them had no adequate words for. The problem had no name because the system that produced it had no name, or rather had only flattering names: togetherness, the feminine mystique, the good life, that described the exterior of the arrangement and said nothing useful about its interior. The decade would not remain sealed. The Equal Pay Act would be signed into law in June of 1963. The same year, the feminine mystique appeared in bookshops. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 would include, through the late addition of a single word, sex, to Title VII's list of protected categories, a legal mechanism that women's advocates would spend the following decades learning to use. President John F. Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women, established in December of 1961 and chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt until her death in November of 1962, produced a report in October of 1963 that documented, in the measured language of governmental review, the systematic legal and economic disadvantages under which American women were living. The machinery of change was assembling itself, incrementally and without drama, in the years immediately following the period this account has described. But in the autumn of 1953 or 1955 or 1958, in the houses on the eastern edge of Nassau County and in the courts of Park Forest and on the quiet streets of Levittown, none of this was yet visible. The alarm clock sounded at 5:15. The woman rose in the darkness, moved quietly through the house so as not to wake her husband or her children, and began, in the pale light coming to the kitchen window, the work of assembling herself and her household into the form that the day required. The coffee percolated on the stove. The ironing board stood folded against the wall, waiting for Tuesday. Outside, the commuter train ran south toward the city, its sound fading quickly into the general stillness of the morning, and the neighborhood settled back into particular silence of a place where everything was on the surface, exactly as it was supposed to be.